we're going to go ahead and get started regardless. Thank you guys for being here, and Laura, turn your hand. We're going to be doing an overview today of LCAP, LCAP and accountability. I have a fabulous team with me today. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I think most of you know me. I'm Kate Lane. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Business Services here at the County Office of Education, and I oversee the LCAP review and approval process. And to my left, Brooks Allen.
Good morning.
Right.
Legal counsel and liaison with the Development Club for Education Excellence. We're in County Office of Education. Partially here, I do probably as much to my past role, working as the Deputy Officer at the State Board of Education, having worked on development of LCAP and working regularly.
Very good. Thank you so much, Brooks.
All right, then as a quick opener, if you could just turn to your elbow partner and just talk very briefly about plans that you create within your districts, and what are some of the positive aspects of those plans, and what are some of the things that you'd like to have fixed. You can talk about LCAP, you can talk about single plan, you can talk about a number of different things, but just give you 2 minutes to do that. Ready? Go. Go ahead.
Oh, these are mine. All right.
Oh, as I live and breathe. All right. That's great. Anybody want to share out something that they love about their plan? Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started then. All right, this first slide right here, this is a slide that we've used quite a bit as a center point for the work that we're doing with LCAP and accountability. Several years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, we were presented with this idea of LCAP, and it was a monster document that seemed to did not really have a whole lot of connectivity to what we're doing on the day-to-day, and that while your plans were all really great and well thought and very comprehensive, there was some connectivity there that maybe didn't exist. The state then brought in the dashboard, which brought in the accountability piece, where you actually were starting to see, oh, I wrote these goals and actions, and now there's actually some ability to measure them. And then with that, there was the opportunity for those that were seeing that their actions and services students. We brought in the differentiated assistance process, which is a year-to-year process. So that's just a centering slide to remind you of what LCAP and what LCFF is all about. Your plan is attached to your budget and to your accountability, and then to improvement and back around again. Okay, so what we're going to look at really quickly today, these are some dashboard updates. This year, starting in the fall, there'll be the incorporation of the alternative assessment will show up in the dashboard in both ELA and math. We're going to start to see the incorporation of a 5-year graduation rate. The local indicator self-reflection tool, we're going to go into that a little bit more later. There's also a little bit more depth there. You're going to start seeing a little bit more leaning in towards family engagement as opposed to just parent engagement. We're also going to look at the application of the 3x5 color grid for college and career. And you're going to start seeing your English learner progress indicator start showing back up. We have enough data now to give a status for the English language proficient indicator. You all will receive a copy of this PowerPoint. Underneath this PowerPoint, there's a lot more detail that talks about each one of those items. So as far as your dashboard and your local indicators, just as a reminder, you are working on those indicators right now. They're part of your LCAP. They're part of your annual review. So you did last year in November, you talked about how you were doing with your parent engagement. That's in your LCAP action step. So you're measuring that particular item right now. Same with your Common Core, your implementation of Common Core, as well as your broad course of study. So for the spring, that's what just caught you up right there. Summer, you're going to submit your LCAP. And in the fall, you'll see your performance reported on all of those areas on the dashboard. November is when you will start putting in new information for your local indicators in the fall. All right, again, okay, so I want seeking input for decision making. So it's taking it a step further. It's really asking you to talk about how rich it is and how deep you're going. Stakeholder engagement continues to be probably the most important fact and feature of your LCAP, and it's the one that's probably looked at the most at the state level. All right, so now we're going to jump right into LCAP and LCFF. We're going to talk about timeline, template, and then planning for 2020 to 22. All right, so quickly, your timeline right now, March, April, you should be working on your annual updates, your actions and your budget, and reviewing with us. This is the end of a third-year plan, so unless you're making wholesale changes on your goals and actions at this point, we're not anticipating that there's a great need for targeted assistance. We have met with a few districts at this point, but again, the demand may be coming later on when we start looking at a brand new LCAP. Goals, actions, and services should also, we're about to merge into, you're looking at goals, actions, and services, and again, reviewing with us. For some of you, if you have a comprehensive support district and or differentiated assistance, there's work that you've been doing right now that may influence what you're doing going forward, and so we would want to work a little bit closely with those districts to make sure that that you get a clear message about what you can do to your LCAP versus what you can't do. So there's some things you can't change. And then by July 1, your LCAPs are due, hard copies, and of your LCAPs and budgets are submitted to education.
And when we say by July 1st, so that's the statutory date, is it no later than July 1st? But we're looking at when do you have your public hearings for your LCAP and budget adoption, and when do you have your final board meeting set to approve the LCAP and the budget. And if you could turn them into us as soon as approved, then that gives us a head start. Because for many of you, you're going to be approving these early in June. Right? The smaller the district, the more likely it is the first week in June that your LCAP and budget are done. And so that allows us that whole month to get going and gives us a little bit of a head start. So we'll be calling you if we haven't received your LCAP.
Yeah, as Kate said, we will actually be able to start reviewing many of your LCAPs in June. Okay, clarifying questions will be created by August 15th, and we'll send you any clarifying questions that we have. I'm not hearing any oohs or ahs about the transition. This is a fairly dry presentation. I really worked on these transitions.
But you know what? The slide transitions are really cool.
All right, these are just quick reminders. And I've already said this about stakeholder engagement. Transparency is also the key. Our office has a very clear role about how we're supposed to review. We try not to be judgy. Every LCAP is different. And so we keep that in mind. 2020, oh, that's actually the wrong date, but 2020 to 2021 will be a great opportunity You are sitting on a 3-year plan right now. It's probably a little stale. It was written before the dashboard was really very useful. So we're expecting that this is an exciting time for all of you and that you will be looking forward to, I don't know, taking a black pen and saying, not this one, we want this, and really taking a chance to redo your plan in the way that you would like it to be. Getting it as close to the site level where the plan is actually being measured on the day-to-day as possible. Bob?
So with that in mind, I'm already getting feedback from stakeholder groups.
Great.
Why are we talking about this? Let's take that one out. Let's focus really closely on this and this part of our plan. So going forward, what I'm hearing from our stakeholder groups is to narrow down our focus on some things really specific around student achievement and county engagement, student engagement. So
I think
do
as
I need
long
to wait for 2021 okay?
No, I would start drawing that breadcrumb trail now. And remember, you have those 8 priorities that you have to meet at the local and the state. And as long as your LCAP continues to meet the needs of your 3 protected groups as well as those those priorities, I would start drawing that nexus now. And I know with some of our differentiated assistance districts, they're actually doing that where they're discontinuing an action step. And then in the analysis section saying, we did this look, this was an action that we no longer are interested in doing. And so anticipate that in the next LCAP, there'll be a complete difference here. So just draw the line for yourself.
So I like line better than breadcrumbs.
Right, breadcrumbs can be eaten. Depends on the guy, I get it.
So I think it all comes down to your annual update, right? So you have an opportunity in the annual update to really review the actions and determine and do some thoughtful analysis whether those actions are actually moving the dial, right? Are they helping you to achieve the overarching goal? If they're not, is that action completely the wrong action? Or do you need to modify that action somewhat? Or do you need something brand new? Are you achieving the goal, right? And if we're not achieving the goal, then that's a good idea to change up the action step. And so I think that whole annual update gives you that opportunity. You get to do some analysis as to how is this working? Is this getting us there? And then if it's not, then there's a place for you to talk about, well, how are we going to change this as we go forward? So that you've really given your readers an opportunity to connect the whole outcome.
Okay. All right, single school districts. Do you have any single school districts in the room? Okay, your single plan and your LCAP can be one and the same. So you actually don't need to do each of these single plan. You can use all of that in the LCAP. I know it's not exciting. And then, of course, there'll be some really exciting professional development. One of the things that we've learned through this differentiated assistance process is the importance of involving an entire team, but using it to really influence how your plan should look. So that will actually be a great part of our professional development in the fall. All right.
How do I advance it? There we go.
I know. Thank you.
And Laura gets full credit because I said my slide had no bells or whistles, so she literally added bells and whistles to my slide. Laura, Trey, and everyone. So I was asked to give a little more in-depth presentation about a couple of issues that have gotten a lot more attention statewide, in large part because, as many of you, perhaps all of you are aware, parents, community members, teachers, administrators, anyone can file a uniform complaint. It's the same district-wide complaint process that we have for other issues that we've traditionally dealt with things around categoricals, Williams standards. You can file a Williams complaint if one step of the LCFF process wasn't followed. So that could be that a step in the stakeholder engagement process wasn't followed. It can be that something in the LCAP statutes wasn't followed. You can file a complaint. We have seen since the early days of LCFF, when I was still there in Sacramento in 2013, a big question about, hey, what can you complain about? And then if you do complain, what happens with those? And we've seen that some that have gotten particular attention. There's one out of LA Unified that had to deal with attributing increases, improvements of services, dealing with students with disabilities, you may have heard of. There was one in Fresno Unified where they talked about, again, an attribution of increased improved services having to do with a shot spotter system. essentially technology that identifies if there's been shocks in the community, contributing those expenses towards increases improvements to students. That resulted in a UCP decision by the California Department of Ed that got a lot of attention. So I was asked to come and talk to you a little bit today about two big things that we're seeing even more so now coming out of UCPs. And one, and Laura touched upon this a little bit, has to do with stakeholder engagement. So it's always useful, we think, to kind of go back to kind of the origins of how did we get the statutes that we have, the regulations that we have, and what are the points of emphasis that are coming out through the stakeholder engagement complaints. One of the things that comes up, and I'll say state PTA, which Kate and Lauren are talking about, the state PTA asked this question very early on, because out of all districts in the state, LA Unified was being very restrictive about how they're holding their parent advisory committee meetings and their English learner parent advisory committees. Well, so then in their case, they're using the BLACs, and just rolling them over, right? And one of the things they said is, they said, wait, these are all confined by the Brown Act. And so they said, if you were a member of one of these committees, so if you've been a member of the Parent Advisory Committee, the EL Parent Advisory Committee, because of the Brown Act, you'd be treated just like one of your governing board members, and you couldn't talk with one of your other committee members outside of that meeting about something falling within the scope of the LCAP. As you can imagine, this created a lot of concern because folks said, wait a second, I'm here because I want to contribute, I want to be part of these conversations. You're saying once I step out of this room, I can't do it anymore. So there was clarification in the state education code. So it's very clear now that all these meetings are governed by what's called the Green Act. And the Green Act is with an E, so, like Leroy Green. And that is that they have to be open public meetings. That's what the basics come down to. So if you have your Parent Advisory Committee meeting, you have your LCAP meeting, they have to be open to the public, they have to be noticed, but they don't have to follow the formal requirements of the Brown Act. And if folks have further questions about that, there are entire presentations. If you kind of Google Green Act, you can see all the details of what's required there. The core of it is the Green Act was supposed to be this much more user-friendly way of having public meetings that allows folks to be aware, to come in, to participate in those meetings, but not be as constrained as the Brown Act in terms of actually being members of that group. So a good thing to remember, just in terms of keeping those public, making sure folks know about the PAC meetings and about the LPAC meetings. Other sources of issues that tend to come up in this context. Who are on your parent advisory committees? Who are on your LPAC? Another issue that came up very early on has been clarified in the statute, and sometimes we see folks aren't aware of it. A majority of the members of these groups, it seems, should be self-evident. But if you have a parent advisory committee, a majority of the members of that parent advisory committee should be parents. That wasn't always the case. Hasn't always been the case. So make sure that they are. Sometimes folks have staff, both district level staff, site level staff coming in and being part of those groups, or kind of trying to use existing bodies to do that. Make sure a majority are parents. There's also a requirement, much like how you see increased improvement of services for English learner students, students from low-income families, and foster youth. You have to have representatives of those groups on your parent advisory committee. Now, sometimes the folks say, look, we tried everything we can, great, document that, right? If you ultimately can't do it, that's not ideal, but if you can, just document it and demonstrate that you made every effort to do that, and that can help demonstrate if the issue ever comes up, which it is increasingly across the state. LPAC, same thing, right? Make sure the majority of the parents are parents of English learners, right? That's the whole point of having that advisory group. Make sure that does. Sometimes we've seen folks who are trying to kind of fold the groups in upon each other. I would just say be careful about doing that. Make sure you're very clear about why when you're folding those groups in. Oftentimes that means you start to run afoul of some of these requirements. If someone has a complaint about what's coming up, because they'll say, wait a second, we no longer have a majority of parents, for instance, or it's not clear about if you have a majority of your LPAC members are now being kind of folded in. Now all of a sudden are the parents of English learners only kind of 2 of 20, right? That could be an issue if you're saying if that serves as your LPAC. So think about some of those issues. Other issues that tend to come up, the requirements in statute that the Parent Advisory Committee and the LPAC have an opportunity to submit comments about the LCAP and then receive responses in writing. Oftentimes we're not seeing that necessarily coming up, and you're seeing UCP complaints coming up around the state. You're also seeing folks bring up the fact that there's supposed to be an opportunity, a notice that goes out to the public that says, hey, you have an opportunity to comment on this on your LCAP in writing. Just have to make sure that they're aware that happens. Again, if you're transparent, you're taking it to your board, you're posting notices, all of this just kind of happens naturally. But you have to make sure that you are kind of hitting the marks with respect to those pieces. Another big issue that comes up regularly across the state are translation requirements, both within these meetings, of the Parent Advisory Committee meetings and the LPAC meetings, as well as in the notices that go home. So again, a reminder, I think most of you are probably aware of these. If you have 15% or more of your students have home language other than English, those notices need to be produced in that language. Right? Best practice, obviously, if you have parents who are participating, particularly, I would hope this would be self-evident, if you have the LPAC meetings, but again, we've seen folks kind of fall down this one. The LPAC meeting should have someone who's available to translate in languages that are spoken by the parents who are there. Otherwise, you don't really have meaningful engagement. Right? So these are just some of the obvious ones that keep popping up around the state. The next big topic is the one that...
Can I just, before you move on, so documenting how you have formed your parent advisory committee, who sits on that parent advisory committee, that there is no requirement in code for the board to appoint the parent advisory committee, correct?
Correct.
But if you did take that as a board action, then that's probably about the best documentation you can get as to how is your parent advisory committee formed,
Sure.
and who would sit on it, when are the meetings held, how do you...
Parent Advisory Committee was, right, A. B, if I found out, how do I know who, when they meet, who's on it, right? So if I want to go talk to someone who's on it, how do I know who's there? So again, it just goes back to kind of original intent when you think about local control funding formula, right? Part of the whole idea was it was supposed to be quote-unquote local control. By trying to strip away some of the strings tied to categorical funds, the idea was we're going to leave these decisions more to local communities, local governing boards to make these decisions. But in order to do that, we need some assurances that there's going to be really authentic, sincere local engagement. So folks have a chance to feel like they're heard. So again, anything you can do, bless you, that you can do to make sure that you are open, clear, transparent, and folks are doing it. Especially, I know sometimes when things start to get rolling, you kind of use to standard practice, that can get kind of lost in the mix. To just kind of take a chance to take another look at that and make sure that you're covering all those grounds. Because we are seeing community members increasingly aware of what the rules are and using the complaint process, among other things, to make sure that those rules are being followed. So with respect to the second topic, which we were talking to our colleagues at the California Department of Ed late last week, we said, what is overall, what's the issue you continue to see the most in terms of what you see as complaints that come up on appeal? And by far, they said, the stakeholder engagement's up there, but by far, it is folks providing, with in their language, inadequate, or sometimes just no explanation at all. No explanation, description, rationale for your demonstration of increased or improved services for your English language learner students, your low-income students, and your foster youth. Right? We talk about supplemental concentration funds, what you have to do in your LPAC to show that you are increasing or improving services. So I think probably the best thing I can do to provide some context for some of the details I'm going to share is to just, again, remind us of where this came from. Right? So, again, 2013, you're seeing categoricals, that either been flexed or that they're getting rid of, and they're saying, okay, we're going to give districts a lot more authority, a lot more discretion over how to use their funds. And when we produce additional funds that are generated because there's acknowledgement that students who are from low-income families, English learners, and foster youth have additional needs, and so we're going to produce additional funds and give those to you. What's the great fear that's happening across Sacramento from advocacy groups, legislators, and others? Their fear is either go into salaries or just, and I would say more generally, although that's a huge component of it, it's just going to be spread so thin you're not going to really see any impact. And so for, quote unquote, our students who we've been working for, depending any group, whether I'm a disability rights advocate, right, whether I'm someone that really worked really hard on the economic impact aid program previously, right, I'm going to say, wait, my great fear is all of a sudden when these funds had to be really targeted before, they're just going to be spread out and I'm going to see any real benefit. So there was a real tension when they came down to the state board to try to wrestle with what are these regulations, how are we going to have what are quote-unquote spending requirements, although they were meant to be basically translated into something that allows you to just demonstrate how you're increasing and improving services. So the presumption is that when you're going about showing how you're increasing or improving services in proportion to the amount of funds you get, that supplemental concentration that's above your base dollars, and you have to do that demonstration, the presumption is if you're still sticking with more targeted programs, right? So if you're investing in services, actions and services that are targeted, we don't need to see as much in your LCAP. Okay, we understand that those are targeted, there's a certain presumption that's built in that those are really benefiting those students. The challenge becomes when you have a district that says, well, actually, we think the most effective thing we can do, or the best way we want to use our funds, is to spend these funds on district-wide services or action. Right? And in particular, I'll cover both of these scenarios, but in particular, when you have a district that doesn't have at least, and the exact percentage is 55% of your students or less. So if you're under that threshold of English language learners, low-income students, and foster youth, then the presumption is, wait a second, so you don't even really have a large majority of those students, and you still think the best thing to do with those funds is not to be targeted, but to spread it out, that begs some questions. And so the LCAP, they're going to the LCAP really asks you for more justification and really demonstrate that you've had a thoughtful discussion at the district level about why this makes the most sense. And it's sticking in my head now. The LCAP really is supposed to walk you through the steps of showing that. And that's also true, and I'll say some of this is going to apply just in the same way, but it says kind of footnote this at the school level. So if you say, well, wait a second, it's not necessarily district-wide, although I recognize for some folks it's one and the same. But if it's school-wide, it's 40% is your threshold. So if you decide that the best thing we can do, and we're over threshold, right? We have a site that has more than 40%, we have a district that has over 55%, then really what you have to demonstrate is that it is principally, so your services are principally directed, right? You know, we can talk about the language right here. Principally directed towards and effective in meeting the LCAP goals for those students. And I'll just say real simply, one of the key things to figure out is not making the mistake that we've had some very large districts in the state, including LA Unified, who've done this, starting to conflate these three student groups with others, and either talking about quote-unquote underprivileged students, talking about at-risk students, talking about these in broad categories that are not specific to these three student populations. All right, they're not to be conflated with the others. In fact, there's a recent UCP decision that calls that out in great detail. It says, no, when you talk about how you are increasing and improving services for these three student groups, talk about these three student groups. Don't conflate them, otherwise we can't really tell what you're doing. And you need to demonstrate and identify what are your goals for those students. Right? So oftentimes, if you just have a couple goals that apply for all, you have to be really clear about calling out why it is that that goal for all really applies for these students. And again, why it is, right, principally directed towards and effective in meeting those stated goals for those students. And then if you're below those thresholds, so if the school is below that threshold, if the district is below those thresholds, because you don't have that, we talked about, now really, you think better than targeted, you really want to spread it then, even though we don't have a great majority, it's not like 90, 95%, or even 75% of your students fall in that category. Okay, so now you need to be able to demonstrate not only how they are principally directed and effective in, but also you need to show why this is actually the most effective use of these funds to meet those goals. And then describe the basis for that determination. So it's not enough, and again, we saw, particularly in the first couple of years, a lot of LCAPs around the state would say, just declare it. Right? This is the most effective use of funds, period, and be done. Right? No, you have to describe what's the basis for that determination. And so ideally, I think all of us can understand, it's just supposed to kind of show your work. Right? It's supposed to say, hey, and we thought about these possibilities. It's really not that much money, right? So when we really try to figure it out, what could we do? We could do a little program over here, or really what we could do is we could amplify the program in this way. We really consider the needs of the students that fall in these three groups. We consider our goals, and truly we said this is going to be the most effective thing. We made that determination. Great, just show your work. Just explain that process. And then in particular it talks about, have you considered alternatives? Right? And usually, I mean, the obvious alternative is to think about not going district or school-wide, but doing something more targeted. But you could have others. And then you provide additional basis for that. Research, educational theory, or, and this one was a big part when we were part of the regs process, folks said, hey, sometimes we don't have a study, a site. I just know, I've been a district administrator for 20 years. I know what works. Right? And so based on my experience, and I explained this to the board, we think this is going to be the most effective. Okay? Experience is one of the things that's listed there that could be included. But it just needs to be explained. So, again, the easy thing, if it's targeted, that's easy, but you have to explain how it's tied to the goals. If it's district-wide, school-wide, you're above threshold, principally directed, right, and effective, and call out those goals specific to those students. If you're under that threshold, so therefore kind of there's a much higher justification bar you're going to have to cover if you want to do this district-wide or school-wide. Just show your work, right? Talk about why it's most effective, and then provide the basis for that determination. And again, these are the ones that across the state, and we've seen a couple here locally within Marin County, continue to just get a lot of attention. So it's something really worth telling to all your boards and to your colleagues to really pay some close attention.
You guys have any questions about that? It's kind of big topic. Very important. Yeah, no, I would imagine everybody's thinking on that one. Okay. We're going to go
That's
right.
okay, because we're going to hit it again towards the end of this presentation, so you have an opportunity to be thinking about it.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. We're going to go over just really quickly, we're going to go over some changes to the template. The changes that you're going to be seeing, if you haven't already gone into DTS, I know a number of you use like a Google Doc or a shared drive to do a lot of your LCAP work, so you may or may not have gone into DTS yet. What you're going to start seeing in there is largely related to budget. There isn't a whole lot. In fact, there's no change at all to any of the annual updates. Content of the actions and services is solely related to the budget piece. So, and again, what we're trying to do is improve upon the product where the LCAP is that much more transparent, using language that's super understandable. It needs to be, the budget piece really should be done alongside with the plan. So they, as much as possible, your two departments or your three departments, however, should be working as much as possible on this. And then, of course, it needs to be reported on your website. It needs to be posted very clearly on your website. It can't be buried. It has to be fairly close to the front of your website.
Prominently displayed.
Prominently displayed. Thank you. That was what I was
page
struggling
of
with.
your website. Another piece with that also is that the budget overview for parents must be provided at your public hearings. So when you hold your public hearing for your LCAP and your budget, then you're going to need your LCAP as well as your budget overview for parents. For the LCAP piece and the budget, you'll have your budget and your reserve requirement disclosure. So
Do you want to go ahead and go right into that?
So I think everybody got that, right? Just make sure that you have that piece when you go to your public hearing.
Okay. All right. And this is an example of the budget overview.
Carolina, perhaps you could come and join us up front here. So this new template for the budget overview, it's available to you as an Excel document that CDE created, and it's set up as a template that you just enter the data that you see there, and then it produces these graphs and charts. It's also been replicated within DTS, correct?
Yes.
And if you want to pull it in.
Yes,
Actually, I
correct.
just pulled, Kentfield was nice enough to give us permission to
They already
look at their
started?
product. Yeah, so
Okay, great.
that sheet that you were looking at was just a screenshot of what you'll actually be entering. The product actually looks like this. It's a 2-page document, and it creates these really nice looking pie charts. This is a draft, obviously, of Kentfield. And do you guys want to say anything about it? Okay, sorry. Really?
The only thing I can add to this chart is that as part of the review, we will match it with your formal one. So the local funds, the LCF funds, all those will match your formal one. I mean, for the DBOs in the room, that's how we're going to test it, and it should flow. And on the input, it will, on DTS, it's not adding automatically, so that's something that we're going to fix. But in the Excel template provided by CDE, it does automatically add up itself, because it says to list the LCFF funding, and then within that, you have to also input the supplemental and concentration funds. But once you put them all together, it doesn't add up to the bottom because it's embedded in the LCFF funds. But the Excel template does have the right calculation.
So you're in here. This is what you're talking about, the input form?
Yes, if you go into the input form.
Okay, so this is Laguna's.
Yeah, this is Laguna. So in your LCFS calculators that we send out, in your Formal 1, you're going to have as LCFS sources, it's going to be the 174,000 amount. But within that 174, the 35,000 are part of it. But if you look at it in this way, it doesn't add up to 220, right?
So this is just from the LCFF calculated for basic aid district, because that's not reflected here. When it says LCFS sources, please define.
So total LCFF funds should be your total LCFF sources as reported in your general fund.
Which includes basic aid.
Which includes your basic aid excess, would also include the EPA funding as well. And it's just we found that this will trip you up a little bit, because most people, when they see a column of numbers with a total at the bottom, they assume that you're adding them up, right? Whereas in fact, that second line, the LCFF supplemental and concentration, is a subset. It's a component of the total LCFF. And so they should not have put it in the same column.
No.
So
Maybe Dick made a different
pains
color.
to point this out to you, because this is just one of those little things. It's a little technical detail that ends up, it's the sort of thing where you're banging your head against a brick wall going, why can't I get this, right?
Here's two more points that I noticed in creating this. Is if you scroll down, you see our supplemental concentrations is a total of 35,000 for this district.
How far down you want me?
Right there. And so now we said total budgeted expenditures for high-need students is 44. So clearly we're above the supplemental and concentration. If that amount was less than your supplemental and concentration, you're going to have an additional prompt explaining why it's less and how it's going to increase and improve services for those kids. The same with the total budgeted, or in this case.
Yeah, and let's just stop right there for a minute. Right? So this, I think, has been in an area of confusion in the demonstration of increased and improved services. For the accounting folk in the room, you look at return to go, don't collect your $200, right? Instead, it gives you a prompt to explain how are you meeting the standard.
Exactly. And that's, pretty much straightforward. So, I don't know. Thank
so
you.
much, Karen.
Yeah, that was helpful.
Thank you.
Let me just... Maybe. Hold on. Where is it, Liz? Is it in that one?
So it's,
Right there.
oh, how fabulous.
Yeah, the only thing you need to do, I believe, is sometimes the student ethnicity is either blank or wrong. Yeah. Yeah, so this is handy dandy. Yeah, isn't it? Yeah, and this is available. We've asked that they populate all of yours each year, but not all access it. So then it'll go down to, sorry, I'm going very fast through this, and I don't need to be. Let me get rid of it. All right, so here we have LCAP Goal 1. List the state priorities.
Well, that's so very helpful. I mean, for most of us, we know that a 200-page LCAP is a little indigestible for most folk. And so having some ways.
I'm trying to not make you sick. I'm trying to get to the bottom of this so you can see that. There we go. Talks about your stakeholder engagement.
And then we make our own progress for our budget very much more. I really do that things.
It's very simple.
Uh-huh. All good information.
Nobody here. In anything to do with its creation.
They just have DTS too, everything. It just comes out better.
Yeah, it just looks prettier.
That's from the beginning. But you also showed that the budget supplemental worksheet, the one that you showed me before.
Oh, that's at the end of the LCAP document. Let me see if I can get it.
Which is another thing that DTS has.
Well, so if you enter your budget in using just ranges of object codes, for example, then it can total that up for you at the end and can give you a budget summary. And no matter how you input your data, you can get a budget summary from DTS as it's just tallying it up as you enter it, which I think is very, very helpful. Very, very helpful.
This is the summary sheet. But again, you have to be careful of it.
No, there's yeah. Well, this is the budget overview. I know what
Oh.
Raquel is talking about.
Sorry,
is that
it's
if
not
you
even up
use
there.
DTS,
Oh, it's 'cause I have it in presentation
Had
now.
to get into it and pull that up. It would mean going into DTS. We didn't pull up a summary and have one ready for this presentation.
It would be in the archive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't realize I wasn't mirroring. Thanks, Brooks. That's why it's here. And again, this page will add. So you,
And it could be any funding sources beyond just those ones. So if you have some, like that, other, you can be more specific if you have a local foundation or if you have.
And what we would ask you is, as you're using DTS and you're using that drop-down, we're looking at what they have in the drop-down and making sure that everything that's available to you in the drop-down is appropriate. So, for example, we've seen some LCAPs, and I've seen them in other counties, that list the funding source as the general fund. But that is not a funding source, it's an accounting mechanism, right? That's not where you get your money from, right? You got into the general fund from somewhere. Where was that from? So we're double checking those drop downs, make sure that they are all good. But if you find that there's something that you want to be able to express that doesn't exist, just call us.
That was
And we
something,
can-
actually, can I just bring that up? So that was something that somebody asked me about was DTS. DTS has something in the drop down that CDE doesn't require or what have you.
Yeah.
But I think the clarification that DTS is not CDE.
That's correct.
So I think just people understand necessarily mean that you're meeting requirements or what have you. So I think it's just.
And DTS are very client-centric is what I would say.
Yes.
So you call them and you ask for something, they will go out of their way to necessarily help you, right? So they'll add the general fund for you if you ask for it, but as a funding source, but that's not appropriate, right? So we're asking that if you're looking for something that's not in DTS, call a member of our team, and that way we have that dialogue, we have that interaction, and we can all work together in making sure that we have in our LCAPs what's appropriate.
all right. Okay, is there any questions about that? Okay.
This form has formatting issues, and you can't change it.
No.
So I don't like it, and I'm not going to use it.
You can't, you have to use it. You
Can I use the DTS one?
Oh, this is DTS. Are you using the state?
Yeah, she's talking. No, it's an Excel template.
Oh.
That CBE sent out.
Yes.
That
Oh,
one has
okay.
formatting.
So you're using DTS. I don't, yeah,
We're going to transfer.
to the DTS one.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that is absolutely fine to use DTS. DTS have ensured that what they will produce with the input that you provide is indeed true to the template, right? So that takes us all back to the, you can't have something that doesn't adhere to the state-approved template. The state have approved the parent budget overview, but using DTS, I mean, they double-check all of their stuff to make sure that it's compliant, it is indeed the official template, and that what you produce out of it is also ADA compliant for posting on the web, because you have to post your LCAP prominently on your homepage, then it must meet the new requirements to make sure that it's totally accessible. They've been a good product for us, I think.
If I could just add, they're a great product, and they can do anything within the an exaggeration, but a lot with the mechanism. What they should not and cannot do is they cannot tell you what you should be doing in your template. So we have had districts get perhaps poor advice from DTS who suggested that they could go ahead and change what was already board approved in a prior year LCAP or prior year actions and services, which then brought those districts into a state of having to undo everything. So if you have any content, form questions, then you should be calling us and or even the CDE, but don't ask DTS, just their device. All right, that's for the most part it about, we're still in just template changes.
So the bottom takeaway from that is this is the new template, this is the new budget, the new piece.
This
of
is
the
a parent
template that will be
piece,
new.
yes.
But beyond that, if you've got a community that has more interest in transparency or clarification about dollars, we should really look at some of those infographics or those summary forms.
Yeah, the infographic is available is available. It's an item on that drop-down list. Yeah.
And you can always add.
And that's been there, but
You
it's
can
just
always add your own summaries.
Yes.
Your own synopses, your own user-friendly narratives or pictures, whatever. You just can't replace
Yeah.
the official LCAP with those things. They can be supplemental to, but they can't be in place of. And we would agree that, yeah, we all have had to spend time and energy on taking the LCAP and putting it into a form in which, indeed, it is digestible, it is understandable, it is accessible to our populations.
For those, this is a template change. You're going to see comprehensive support and improvement is the section in your template. We have 4 districts that are actually have schools that are receiving comprehensive support and improvement, and those districts know who they are. If you don't, and the whole point of this slide is that if you don't have a school in comprehensive support, the only thing you need to put in this section is NA, NA, NA. Not applicable. No schools in comprehensive support. This is a slide that was created so that comprehensive support schools and districts understand what language needs to go in there. In the handout that you'll receive digitally, it has a whole detailed list of that. This is the same with differentiated assistance for our districts that are in differentiated assistance. You'll need to include what you've been doing as a result of your differentiated assistance opportunity within your LCAP. That can occur in your action steps. That can include in your plan. It could be coming in your plan summary as well as your analysis section.
Laura, was there something that you just advised me about the comprehensive support and assistance, right? The timeline on that, if you've been selected this year for comprehensive support.
Comprehensive support is a federal accountability. So there's a very specific criteria. I believe that there's a slide in here that'll show you what it is. They are identifying schools based upon all the same criteria that you're looking at within your dashboard, your academics, your social emotional functioning, your chronic absenteeism. They're identifying schools at this level and providing you a level of support that goes along with it. So the schools that are actually receiving comprehensive support are indeed receiving funding to are receiving funding for this, which is why they need to go through the process of proving it. The comprehensive support is a process that will be done every 3rd year. So if you've been identified for comprehensive support and improvement, it happened this year, and it won't happen again for 3 years. All right? So those schools that have been identified, they're in for 3 years. All the rest of you are off the hook right now as it relates to comprehensive support. Differentiated assistance is a year-to-year look. All right? So that's the state level. That's a very deep, intense process where you work very closely with us. We've had the opportunity to work very closely with a number of districts and figuring out systemically what is going on within your programs that's creating these orange and red items on the dashboard.
And that funding is
For 3 years.
The difference is
The
CSI.
CSI is it's across 3 years.
Across 3 years.
Across 3 years.
Not annual for 3 years.
Nope,
That's
sorry,
correct.
no, yeah.
Yes.
And I believe.
It's
for
not
those
nearly
of
as
you-
much money as it first appears.
I know, it's really exciting for those of you that are receiving comprehensive support improvement, you should have received notice of your first allocation. And if you haven't, then maybe let me know.
That's the funding that was getting mixed up with the LPSBG dollars.
Yes.
So we're both coming out at the
Same
same
time.
time.
Very
so you
confusing.
haven't qualified for the CSI,
Yes.
CSI dollars where LPSBG was different.
Yeah, LPS, that was the low performing school block grant. Those were dollars that were specifically allocated based upon students that performed less than, what is the second tier? 1 or 2 on their CASP. So it wasn't necessarily
Who are not
who are not
identified as non-legal
foster
case.
youth, yeah, or special ed, correct. Right. All right.
Some of them.
That was a lot that we didn't have planned for. All right, thank you, Liz. All right, so now we're just going to go briefly into federal addendum. All right, who did the federal addendum last year? Great, so exciting. So then you already know that you will read it, roll it, but make sure you do Title IV. So for those of you who did it last year, it did not include Title IV. You will need to go in and number 1, perhaps read it to make sure it's still relevant, and then add what you're doing with your Title IV funds. And I believe everybody in this room is getting Title IV funds. Tyler, do you know offhand if are you getting more than 30 for San Rafael for Title IV?
I don't know.
Okay. What about you, Amy? Do you have any idea for Title IV? Some of the larger districts, if you're getting more than $30,000 in Title IV funds, you had to have done a needs assessment. I don't know that we have any districts where you are, correct? Mostly it's $10,000 or less for our county. And again, it's a requirement. It used to be an LEA plan, and now the LCAP, the CONAP, and the federal addendum all together become the federal addendum. This is your timeline. Over here is a link to the questions to make sure that you are the prompts to make sure that you're hitting the right items and answering the correct questions. They just sent an online link so that you could go ahead and submit this. These don't come to us. These go directly into the link.
And what we found as we looked at this addendum last year is that if you had already included your federal dollars and your strategies for using those dollars within your LCAP, then the addendum became really not a lot of work. It was refer to this goal, this action step. If, however, you're one of the districts that have limited your LCAP plan and don't discuss your federal strategies, then you have to do all of that work within your federal addendum. So we believe that all roads in school finance are leading to, and to school operations, all roads lead to the LCAP. And our lives will be easier if we kind of wrap our heads around that and just go for it.
All right, so there's an electronic submission, and then starting July, middle of July, the CD will review, and they'll start contacting you. These reviews are done by departments. So Title I does it, Title II, so you may receive, or not, I'm sure they're perfect, calls from individual departments. All right. Not going to go through this. We don't. This will be a separate thing. I know that was pretty, wasn't it? Yeah. It should, yeah, no, it has to be, sorry, did I not mention that? Yes, it needs to be board approved. Yeah. Yeah, part of the link means, I believe it says in there, I've got in there, board approval date.
But it's included in your LCAP when you do the whole thing. It's not a separate action by the board, or is it separate action?
It can be the same, it can be late meetings, it can be the same meeting, no, it's part of your LCAP federal addendum, and it's part of your LCAP.
So that's what I'm saying. One action for the board to approve my LCAP approves the federal agenda.
I don't believe so, because I don't believe that the federal addendum is indeed a part of the official SBE-approved LCAP template. The federal addendum is an additional piece.
So it's two actions.
So I believe two actions would be appropriate.
But could you just specify you're going to be including the LCAP as well as the LCAP, the federal addendum, like in the one board action, like you're.
I wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't do
I
it.
would, yeah,
Okay.
separately.
I wouldn't do it.
Okay.
What do you think? I mean, he's the lawyer. He
Yeah, what
would
do
be
you-
able to tell us.
I would circulate an answer afterwards. I think the board, so the State Board of Ed did approve the LCAP addendum. So I'm just not, my first instinct based on that is I would say it all goes with one, but I would double check to circulate an answer.
Because that's what makes more sense to me. The template is approved by the state board. The state board incorporated the federal addendum in the template.
Right. The whole tension behind this, just kind of stepping one step back for context. So the state board and the Department of Ed really struggled with. They've got LEA plans, right? And they typically, the whole thing with the LCAP was that the state never really wanted to get LCAP, right? Under local control, the idea was the LCAP stays local. It's approved locally. That's where it should appropriately should stay. But in order to try to tie in these pieces, to try to say for all these planning processes, and as Kate was saying, all the budget roads really in one place, folks said, well, wait a second, yeah, but the LEA plan does because the feds require it. Again, this is if the state had its way, they'd say, no, keep this local too. But they said we can't because, in fact, the state has to approve the LEA plan. And so they said, but instead of having this separate LEA plan process and your LCAP process, we want to try to combine them. And the way to try to combine them is we'll create an addendum. Everyone's talking about like having a 1040 and having your Schedule A. So basically all the federal pieces were supposed to be built in there as opposed to having a separate plan. That does have to go to them. They do have to see the addendum. That's why it gets uploaded, as Laura was saying. But they also want to try to maintain some separation in that because they don't necessarily want to see everything in that way. So that's been part of the struggle about, again, it's where you try to see this lack of real cohesion between state and federal policy. Right? It's the whole reason why you see them kind of wedging in the school onto the LCAP because they don't really want to get in school level, but the feds are requiring that, so hey, we'll throw a little something in that satisfies for compliance reasons. You see a little bit of this with the addendum as well. So it is part of I've understood it to be part of the LCAP template. They've approved it, but I don't know. I have not come across that specific question.
I would just, and I know you guys are going to follow up, because I would say while I agree with Kate for accounting purposes and compliance purposes, it might be cleaner from a board perspective and a public perspective. It's much more confusing to have two separate items. So if we could get clarity, that would be very helpful. I have one action.
All right. All right, Kate. I wrote all over your books on the side.
All right, so there is way too much verbiage. I broke every rule related to PowerPoint presentations when I put this together. And I did it purposefully and expressly. That you're not going to be able to read it in your handouts, but we're going to send this to you digitally. And so we wanted you to have a reference document, basically. And we just want to talk about review and approval, and that we have been, all of us, we've been modifying our approach to LCAP since day one. The LCAP template has changed every year since we started this process. There have been various measures. I would say the demonstration of increased and improved has gone through multiple layers of clarification over the course of the years. And as a result, then our review and approval process also has to adapt as we gain a better understanding. And our review and approval process has always been, from the very gates, has been, how do we all get to yes? Right? Our interest is in having approvable LCAPs, and to that extent we attempt to provide the support and assistance that you need in order to get there, but also the clarity as to what it is that we're looking for. Lovely. So there are three pieces that we're required to do. The county superintendent, in approving your LCAP, must ensure that the LCAP adheres to the template, that the budget includes sufficient expenditures to implement the actions that are in the LCAP, and that the LCAP adheres to the spending requirements for English learners, low-income students, and foster youth students. So adherence to the template. It sounded such a simple little thing when we read the code. We thought, oh, well, that's a breeze, right? I mean, they're going to use the template that came from the state, and there we go, right? Oh my goodness, this actually becomes a huge part of this whole review process. And so if we walk through those areas that were, what are we looking for in each of the areas? So stakeholder engagement. But there's adequate documentation of how and when you've met with your stakeholders, that you've provided them with the information they need in order to engage on the LCAP. And that you've also documented, so what impact has that specifically had on your LCAP? And some of you have done some just, well, I would say that everybody in Marin engages with their stakeholders on an ongoing and regular basis, right? I mean, the stakeholder engagement is, are you kidding me? You know, you're trying to keep parents away from the school. Of course they're here. Of course they're engaging. I would say some of us have done a better job than others of documenting what that engagement looks like. And so we just really strongly recommend that a thorough documentation process. You know, you have to provide this when your auditors come in, so people listening with the dates that you made, the materials that you provided, and then if there's specific input to a particular goal, then identify that, or the actions in goal. You know, Bob was talking about stakeholder engagement at Shoreline, that he's hearing that the community is saying, well, we don't really need to focus on this. That is great. Stakeholder input and how that stakeholder engagement is impacting the development of your LCAP.
Can you just one other thought about this? Because we are small, you know, we don't have a separate parent advisory committee and English learner parent advisory committee. We use our ULACs and VLACs and PTAs to do that, site councils. You know, so that's what we document to say is that at the smallest elementary PTA meeting and at the smallest high school VLAC meeting.
So I see. So I do believe, though, and I'm going to refer to the lawyer in the room, but I do believe that we must have some kind of documentation of not meeting with the LCAP, but meeting with this group specifically about the LCAP. Right? So if we have a site council meeting, there's lots of things that the site council look at, right? But are we meeting with the site council specifically to talk about
their
LCAP?
agenda, their minutes, and the
Yeah.
discussion about LCAP. Excuse me, LCAP.
LCAP and LCAP.
Yeah. So if you have an agenda where you've identified those are the various different subject areas?
Yeah, I mean, we have some small, so it's very difficult.
Yeah, I think you need to have that clarity, right? So I think so folks have to know that that's your parent advisory committee, where you're treating that group as the same. And then they have the same opportunity that any PAC would, right? So where they give an opportunity to submit questions in writing and have them responded to in writing and make sure that's part of it. They have a chance to actually look at the LCAP. That has to be part of that process.
Very good. The annual update. So we're going to verify that your annual update conforms to the district's 18-19 board-approved LCAP. We have asked DTS to lock down your annual update so that the board-approved goals and actions cannot be amended. What you have access to in DTS is to talk about your reflection and your analysis of how well you have done and if you need to change that. So we're hoping that that change this year will actually help people because there's been confusion over this part, I think, since the beginning of the LCAP. We're looking for meaningful descriptions of the actions performed, the services provided. In other words, please don't just change the tense on what it was that you planned to do and what you planned to do. Yeah, we did it. A little flesh on the bones is very helpful there. Think about what is the reader going to gain from this? And a reader gains frustration from reading the same sentence in one tense and then another, right? They don't learn anything from that. Thoughtful analysis of your successes and maybe not successes. That the whole point of LCAP as a continuous improvement plan, I think that thoughtful analysis is probably the key to the whole part. If you never have that analysis, then you're not in a continuous improvement mode. And a description of any modifications that you're going to be making to your LCAP. We refer to them as breadcrumbs. We've been lost in the forest with Hansel and Gretel, and we really like our breadcrumbs. It really helps us as reviewers to understand where you're going with your LCAP. And as reviewers, what we're doing, we're reading your LCAP. So then, in many ways, we're just like any other member of the public. And we're fairly experienced with reading LCAPs. If we can't put the pieces together, then your public certainly can't. Your goals. We're really not anticipating any major changes in goals in the 1920 LCAP. It's the third and final year of a 3-year plan. And so if you do have new goals in mind, maybe now's the time to start thinking about them and talking about them for the next 3-year plan. Now, if there's something that you're just raring to go, and by golly, we're going to add this new goal, then by all means go for it. But we will be surprised if we see new goals at this stage of this LCAP. We would encourage you to review the state and local priorities being addressed by each goal. We've given you feedback in the previous iterations. If you'd like us to resend that feedback, we're happy to do that. If you just want to meet and go over this area in particular, this has been an area that we've had to place some emphasis on. And that's, make sure that we've addressed all 8 of the state priorities between your goals. You don't need to address any state priority more than once, but you must address each one at least once. And review your estimated measurable outcomes and make sure that you're using the appropriate metrics. That there are metrics that are specific to specific state priorities. If you're addressing a state priority, if you're addressing student outcomes, there are some very specific metrics that you must use. But there may also be local metrics that would be very meaningful to you. So really think about how you're measuring your progress and whether the measures you've chosen tell you what you need to know. Actions and services should clearly indicate if they are either contributing to or, that's an or, it's not an and, it's an or. You get to choose one or the other, not contributing to the district's demonstration of increased and improved services. What I would say here is very often we may have actions that are absolutely contributing to the needs of one of the students that are identified, but perhaps we're using Title I funds. Title I funds don't help us demonstrate increased or improved services under the LCFS spending requirement. They may help us demonstrate compliance with federal actions, but they don't demonstrate compliance with this. You may be using a combination of Title I and supplemental concentration grant funds for a single action. It's multi-funded. Well, then yes, then that is demonstrating and you are indeed working towards an increased or improved service. If you are contributing to increased or improved services, clearly indicate whether this is on a wide basis, it's across a school, or it's across a district, or it is limited to those students that are generating those funds. So we have to look at the budget to determine that it has sufficient expenditures. I'm going to do something a little bit differently this year, but let's see, that's at the end of this. So the first thing is you've got to clearly identify where did you get the money from. And for the DBOs in the room, and probably for many of the others of you, you're used to looking at your budget and you see that you've got 4 various sources of revenues. It can be LCFF, it can be federal, it could be other state, or it could be other local. Those are the 4 CSAM definitions, CSAM, California School Accounting Manual, right? We're required to use those definitions, and I prefer the English language rather than the codes, even though I know the codes, I know the public doesn't. So, LCFF, federal, other state, or other local, those are your four sources of funding, right? But there really isn't anything else. If you're pulling in, even if you're pulling in your cafeteria program in Fund 13, what have you got? You've got federal and other state funds, and you might have local contributions. If you have an action that is multi-funded, then you must identify the amount of each revenue source being used. And so I would never discourage anybody from multi-funding. You should multi-fund, especially when we look at some of these little dribbles of money you get. You need to put them together with other funds in order to build a program. I don't know anybody that runs a Title I program without contributed funds to that program, for example. If you're identifying something as contributing to demonstrating increased or improved services, then LCFF needs to be one of the funding sources. Now, we've said in the past that you should identify supplemental concentration, that there is no such requirement in the code. You just need to identify that it's LCFF. If you want to go that extra step, you can go that extra step, but you're not required to. Your budget reference. So we have to identify, so where's the money coming from? And then where am I spending it? How am I spending it? Am I spending it on salaries? Am I spending it on supplies, on services, and whatever? Again, we would encourage you to use words, not codes. 1XXX-3XXX means nothing to the general public, whereas salaries and benefits means everything to the general public. Right? Don't need a breakdown of 1,000s, 2,000s, 3,000s necessarily. Does that help the public, right? You're thinking about who is the document for. And we would also encourage you that natural classification or object code classification isn't the only way in which we talk about our budget. So functional classification can be a very useful way. And one of the things that I think about, there's just so many different things. If you were talking about food services, right? It's identified with a specific function. It could have salaries, benefits, supplies, services, the whole range. But just saying food services, that is something that is meaningful to your general public, and to your reviewers is, oh great, let me go look for function 3600. Hey presto, I'm home. Transportation is a similar thing. Maintenance and operations are a similar thing. So really think about how you're spending your money and how is that most easily understandable both to your general public, and it gives us enough breadcrumbs that we can get there. We're going to do something a little bit different this year. We've talked about it for the last couple of years, but we're actually going to follow through this year, and that is that we're going to take a sample of expenditures from your annual update, from your LCAP, and we're going to ask you to provide us support. How can we find this in the budget? What does it represent? And we'll get those, and it'll be a very short list. I'm thinking, sample means a sample is a very short list. We'll get those out to you very early in the day. We're already going through to make our selections from the annual update because we already know what to have in your annual update. And again, so we may have chosen, we'll see when we get there. But call our team if you have any questions on that. But again, we are going to try and get it to you early enough that you can be sort of done with this process in very early July as well. So the LCFF spending requirements, as we said earlier, even though it's referred to as the spending requirements, there is no requirement for us to identify a specific dollar amount. It's all about your proportionate increase or improvement in services. That is based upon how much supplemental and concentration grant funds you're entitled to in proportion to your total LCFF funds. So it's simply a percentage. So we'd ask you to identify a clear line between those actions that are provided on a wide basis and those actions that are provided on a limited basis. So when you get to that demonstration section. Some of you have already made that move. We're asking all of you to make that move. List your limited actions and describe them and where we can find them and how much they're increasing and improving, and then list your wide actions. For your wider actions, we would expect that everything that we see written in the demonstration of increased and improved services section, that we can find it actually in the goals and actions. There shouldn't be some brand new and inspiring thing that we see in the demonstration section that we can't find in the LCAP goals and actions, because if we can't find it in the LCAP goals and actions, then what goal are you attempting to achieve with that spending requirement? As Brooke said, if the action is performed on a wide basis and it's for a specific school site and that school has less than 40% students generating supplemental concentration grant funds, then you have to go an extra mile. So for any wide actions, you first of all have to talk about principally directed. If you're not limiting the funds to those students, then first of all you have to talk about principally directed and effective in meeting your district's goals. So when I look at principally directed, I'm thinking to myself, well, then you should have been inspired. This action, why you're performing this action, should have been inspired by the needs of those students. And if you're not thinking specifically about those students and what their specific needs are when you determine that this is the action that you're going to perform, then it's not principally directed towards those students.
Can I provide an example?
Yes, please.
So one example we talked about briefly is there was, I'll use Southern California, where I spent a lot of time as my example, because free of anyone in this room worry about a large district in Southern California that, as part of adopting new instruction materials, right, these folks are bringing on piloting new materials, looking at both those that are aligned to Common Core and now it's MTSS standards. They were doing a district-wide textbook adoption and purchase. And they said because the new adoption for ELA in particular has some elements in it that they think are going to be really helpful for their English learners, they want to attribute basically the expenditure on all of the new instructional materials towards increase and improved services, right, the entire thing. And this was flagged and filed a complaint, and this was found to be inappropriate. I think just thinking through what we've even discussed today in this room, you could say, wait, if you attribute the whole thing, again, was you were going to buy those ELA materials regardless of your student population, right? Now, maybe you chose a particular set. Maybe you even chose a little an add-on or something else that you did. So if they had wanted to go down that road and explain why they did that and attribute a portion of it, and again, showing their work, folks that looked at this, and I know a lot of folks that looked at this pretty seriously, would probably say, yeah, that probably would pass muster. But to take your entire textbook adoption, everything you spent, you'd be buying new instruction materials anyway, and attribute that towards increase and improve, that just didn't pass the test. And so that's kind of one of those things, as Kate was saying, that would never be inspired, right? You're going to be buying your new ELA materials no matter what. That wouldn't be inspired by that, but maybe a section of that could be, or something else. But to just think through that process.
That makes sense to everybody? Very, very good. The other part, if you're below the threshold, is that the funds don't have to just be effective. They have to be the most effective. Well, does that not indicate a comparison? It does. And in fact, the regulations specifically talk about that you have considered alternatives. I don't believe, Laura, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe that I have yet read an LCAP that gives me any documented comparison of the alternatives considered. And so I just say that this is an area for you really to be thinking about. And especially, we have, people tend to think of Marin as being, oh, they're just very rich and they're very vanilla. No, but Marin is a fascinating place. We have such a diverse school population here. So we have districts that are 99% of their students are considered high need. They're English learners, they're low income, or they're foster youth. And then we have districts that 1% of their students meet those criteria. So for those of you, especially on the lower end of the scale, if you have less than the threshold, then really be looking at how are you demonstrating that increased and improved, and what alternatives have you considered? So, I think for many of us, and we encourage everybody to do this, that when this first came about and we had the spending requirement, we said, well, you're already doing things for this population of students. We assume that districts have always been doing the right thing by their students, that they've always been looking to what their students' needs are and how they can address those needs. So look at those actions that you already have in place. This is not to add a whole new set of requirements. This is for you to look at your system as a whole and see how are you addressing your students' needs. So for many of you, you may have actions, you may have strategies in place that long predate the LCFF and seem absolutely appropriate use of money. We just encourage you to have a look at it again and say, okay, we've been doing this for the last 20 years. Are we really inspired by those students' needs? What indeed do we know are our students' needs in that population of students? Can we really define what it is that those students need in order to reach the same goals as any other student?
One other thing came to mind coming out of the conversation. Also, when we talk about the comparison, two issues that come up a lot as questions are what's the comparison that we're making? We're increasing improved as compared to what? Right? It's increased and improved as compared to the services provided to all students for that given fiscal year. Right? So if we're looking at it for the next fiscal year, it's in comparison to the services provided to all students for that year. Occasionally we've had folks who've come in, this is very too early, but we still see it coming now. Is it year over year? It's not a year over year comparison. It's all about for the coming fiscal year compared to what you're doing for all students, how you're increasing and improving services for those students. And those two things, I think, could be really critical in kind of just explaining what you're planning to do.
Yeah, thank you.
And,
that's very important.
And one update, just with respect to our federal addendum question. So we now have opinions from CD and so the Department of Ed and State Board Council from both say it could be a separate action. So the federal addendum take as a separate item. They said, look, it would make all the sense in the world if you could agendize it in the same meeting, back to back, but it would be separate actions. Yeah.
Preferred.
What?
That's preferred or less?
No, it's just they're saying like that would be best practice. There's nothing required about that. But.
Right. And that makes sense in terms of the trying to keep separated. We don't want your whole LCAP, thank you very much. We just want to see your addendum. Whereas if we have a single board action, then they
so it's basically just gave us things. So again, not mandated that it be at the same meeting, but it certainly could be. They said it could make sense, but they would keep this two separate action items.
So to finish that up, then we want to know how you arrived at your conclusions. How did you decide that that was the most effective use of those funds? And of course, that spotlight is for those districts that are below the threshold. If you're above the threshold, it's not the most effective, it's that it's effective in meeting your goals. Right. So our approval process then, we've got 3 criteria. We have to either approve your LCAP or request clarity. And I should have added the dates on here, but you've got the dates up at the beginning, right? So there are a bunch of statutory dates in here, right? So we have to, our requirement is to approve LCAPs by October 8th. But you can't approve an LCAP if you can't, you can't approve the budget if you can't approve the LCAP. You have until September 15th to approve the budget. There's a date in code that says that if you need any clarity on the LCAP in order to reach approval, you must identify, you must address the board, you must notify them by August 15th. So the way that the system is working is we send out board letters of clarification on or before August 15th. You have then returned board approved, revised LCAPs to us generally by the end of the first week in September, for us to then to be able to turn around and quickly review that you've put all of the changes in so that we can get to yay by September 15th, or we've got a little bit of wiggle room. We can push your budget and your LCAP out to October 8th. If we cannot approve your LCAP by October 8th, we can't approve your budget by October 8th, we move to disapprove the budget. So September 15th, if I can't approve your LCAP, we issue a conditional approval of your budget. We have to be able to get to yes by October 8th, otherwise you're in a disapproved budget position, which is not any place that anybody in the room wants to be. So we haven't gotten there yet, and I don't anticipate that that will happen at all this year. But what we have found is that that window of time after we send out our clarification letters, and we've asked you to send that back, and we've given you as much time as we possibly can because we recognize this is a crunch for everybody. So in the past, we've given you until, September 7th, 8th in order to get stuff back to us. And then we have to quickly get through it and get an answer by September 15th. We've cut our own timeline down so slim that we have not been doing the job that we ought to be doing with those final revised board approved LCAPs. So, for that reason, we are going to be moving that date up. So we send you your official communication by August 15th. We need you to return that board approved revised LCAP by August 30th in order for us to review it. So, a few practical considerations in that. That's too short a period of time, and for most of you, if you're on the curricular side of the house, come August 15th, you're in back to school. You could care less about that LCAP, thank you very much. Got other work to do, got real live children showing up, and that's when my energies need to be focused. So if we give you an informal notification by August 1st, no later than August 1st, we will be reaching out to each of you informally to let you know whether or not we're going to need clarity on the LCAP. So we probably likely won't get the official documentation out till August 15th, but our promise to you is that you will know by August 1st. And that way we've given you guys a little bit more time. The other piece that I wanted to discuss with you is, so we're saying if it needs revision that's board approved, well, nobody's going to have a board meeting by August 30th. For most of you, you have your board meetings either in the first or the second week of the month. So I'm thinking that if by August 30th you can give us the document that is going to your board, right, in the first week of September, then that still gives us the opportunity to review it. You know, you've given us your word that no, this is it, this is the final document, and we could move that way. Okay, you have a question?
Yeah, so first off, I appreciate kind of working on that calendar. And it's tight timeline for sure, but just for in regard, this kind of goes back to the stakeholder engagement piece.
Yes.
And so I think as this process is rolling out more and more, we're seeing that just across the state, but specifically here in the county, is that parents are wanting, or guardians are wanting more active engagement with LCAP. And I think maybe that's coming from issues related to budgeting that are coming up. And so, you know, we talked all about the need to send it out, get the feedback from the county advisory committee, and then they're supposed to give a written response. Then there's the public hearing in June, and there's approval in June. It feels a bit weird to then have it reviewed by the county office, right? And then get a clarification letter about some additional changes, then go back and now adopt an updated LCAP without any engagement with the stakeholders.
There has been
So
discussion.
I wonder about what happens there because of that time frame, and I can already feel, how did you adopted this, but then how did you come to your board in September and adopt this without any engagement from me, right? So
there has indeed been, I think, a fair amount of discussion up and down the state about what is the requirement for stakeholder engagement on the board clarification process. And I don't know that is there a clear and distinctive answer to that? I don't believe there is.
No, there was some discussion about whether it had to go all the way, whether you had to restart the process, basically, right? Whether you have to restart the whole
I
thing.
mean, you feel like you're on a hamster wheel a bit, but I just feel like if there's a way to, I mean, I just worry about that.
So, right, and there is, again, 'cause this actually goes to a little use component, but there is a provision that allows you to amend your LCAP, right? In a future year, and that is supposed to restart the process. And so typically it's been, I will say, from I know 3 districts where it became a bigger issue statewide. In all 3, everyone was just encouraged best practice, right? Provide the notice you can provide at the time. Right, let folks know, agendize it, provide an opportunity for a public hearing at that meeting when it comes up again, and adopt it. Yeah, but again, just best practice. Put it out there, show that you've done your work. If you know there's folks who are particularly engaged, make sure they were notified about it, and then bring it back at that point. And it could be something that's further clarified down the line, but at this point, I think that's been the best path to follow.
That answer that for folks. I mean, so there really isn't a clear black and white answer to that. I would say you need to be able to read your local community and what their expectation is, and then knowing that we're going to advise you by August 1st, that you're going to have that letter by August 15th, that we're going to be looking for when is it going back to your board, so what board meeting is it agendized at, then you do have an opportunity to advise your public that it's coming back up again, and that these are the things that are going to be addressed in that amendment. Certainly, I mean, just the better job you can do of advising your public, because that, I agree, it's a very awkward thing, right? You've engaged all of these people throughout this very long process. You've had them read, potentially 100-page documents, right? And now it gets down to the final thing, and they're not part of it. That could feel very, well, if I were the parent that was participating, I would feel like, wow, okay, well, they didn't really care for my input at the end of the day.
Aren't those August revisions typically not substantive? They're more technical.
Well,
Yes
if
and
we've
no.
asked for board clarification, then we would suggest that it is substantive. So you'll know that we sent both forms out. We've sent out technical letters, right? And we've asked you to incorporate those technical findings into an LCAP. And we use that strategy specifically because the very first year, we sent out technical letters. We didn't require folk to actually amend their LCAPs. Well, a lot of our technicals were about expected measurable outcomes and the use of metrics and the state priorities being addressed. And so if you hadn't gone back and actually revised your LCAP, you went to do your annual update the next year, and guess what? You got all those problems are still sitting there, and then it floats forward. And so we were saying that, oh gosh, we actually have to insert in here, because otherwise it just keeps rolling forward through the annual update, and you never address the issue. So we started then, I believe, in the second year of saying technical corrections also need to be actually folded into a revised LCAP. So if it's a technical correction and it's come out as a technical memo, then it is just that. It's not substantive. But if it's a board clarification letter, I'd have to say that's substantive. There we go. So that's just looking at it in a slightly different way, very linear, right? But it's not linear, right? That's why I did the little circular things, because this whole thing is such a circular flow. So October 8th is our absolute drop dead deadline. And I think that we only had to push out to October 8th with a couple of districts last year. I would hope that we'll have 0 this year, but we're prepared for whatever is required. And we got lots of support and technical assistance in order to get us all there. So our team is expanding this year. We're very happy to have Beth join us. Yay, Beth! Does everybody know Beth Credible?
Can we just all give Beth a hand?
Yes. continue to lead the LCAP review process. We have Tom Udick working with our team, but Tom plans vacations in the summer now that he's a retiree, and it's like, that's LCAP review time, Tom. So very, very happy to have that join us. Jordan will again be working in the team and we met her last year. She's become very proficient in all of that software and moving parts of the LCAPs, and even found herself on jury duty this year with a group of parents wanting to know, so you work at schools, well, can you talk to me about LCAP? Bless her, she did. Keith Ritchie has been a part of our LCAP process since the very beginning and will be continuing to do so. And then Carolina will be directing Stephen Oleg. If you could just raise your hand, Stephen Oleg, so everybody know who you are. And Carolina is right there. Will be directing the whole sufficient budgeted expenditures in the LCAP to implement. And I think
that's it. The next slide is really just these are the type of technical supports, to name a few. Kate has touched on a number of those things. And then if you would actually go to the next slide. Okay.
You're brilliant.
Okay, so to quote the intrepid Amy Carter from Nevada, I know this is like drinking water from a fire hose. There's a lot of information in here. So you will get the PowerPoint. If you have any questions right now, we'd be more than happy to take them. The next slide is also a list of some of the resources we talked about, links particularly to, all right? Parent and family engagement links. These are sort of best practices for engaging your parents and families as partners. The federal addendum link, and then a few other LCAP related links there. So, all right. Any questions?
Yes.
At the very beginning, you talked about the change for the local indicator with the self-reflection tool.
Yes.
Can you talk more about that real quick? That was the parent involvement.
The parent/family one? Okay, so what specifically? There's a change that was approved by the state board, I believe March, where it shifted its entire focus from parent engagement to family engagement. It's obviously making an assumption that everybody has a parent. So, and it also broadened the questions that you will be asked to rate and narrative that you'll be able to provide as it relates to what are you doing with engagement. Again, back to stakeholder engagement. There's a huge focus at the state level that you engage your stakeholders, and so this is in response to making sure that you're not just engaging them, you're also encouraging them to be part of your team, as it were. And that you will be specifically putting this information in the fall. Sorry, yes, in November. Well, it was November last year. They weren't completely clear about when. It'll be October, November. Your dashboard will open again by December, so roughly the same timeline for all the other indicators. So I would imagine just before that will be the local indicators. And it's a hard stop. You have to have put it in by the finalized date. They will not reopen it. And if you do not put your information in there, then your information automatically defaults to not met.
Would you take yours in the air?
No, 2 years would be. If you had 2 years of not met, then it drops you into differential.
Even though it's a different.
Yeah, because it's assumed, I think with the exception of maybe one district, everybody has put met as their local indicators, 1, 2, 3, 6, and 7. And so it would default you to not met 1 year. So. Yeah, was that clear enough?
Sure.
Thanks.
No, that's helpful because that was actually going to be my question too about the spring. Like, you're doing it in the fall.
They are
the engaged
fall.
parents in spring.
Yeah.
for
The
the
change
annual
is
update
now,
like that.
yeah, but they don't open it up. The timing of it is odd and off and not super helpful, but yeah, the dashboard as well. But the dashboard again is opening up in December because it's taking into account not just the testing, chronic absenteeism and suspension rates, which don't close until October.
Right. This is just general feedback for the mouthpiece over there. So seriously, because what ends up happening in the fall, when you're having to input the local indicators, you have to now pull yourself out of the current year and remember what you did the previous year for local indicators, in particular on any local indicators. And so it's a little exercise in schizophrenia for us to have to toggle back and forth between the years. So if the state could recognize that and push that window back while we're doing the LCAP updates, it would be really more logical, useful, streamlined. Just get it done and get it out of the way, and then we can move on into the future.
To make that happen.
I no longer work there, but I can see what I can do.
We all saw.
I know. How quickly you got that answer.
But honestly, we do know in the spirit of continuous improvement, we know that the state continues to be open and seeking feedback on how the system and the cycle of LCAP can be more useful. Yeah, and that would be one piece. Little, but
And to that point, I mean, for folks who are interested and haven't already tracked it, there is an effort. They call it the LCAP redesign. The CDEs actually today there's a stakeholder session with some folks taking feedback. So obviously some of the stuff is in code. That's not always easy to change. But for those of you who have frustrations over the years, now is an opportunity. There actually is a new window to kind of look at this. Not they'll necessarily be seen for the coming fall, but they are looking to try to change this up. It's also part of feedback that can go to the legislature to talk about, hey, can we, for instance, not have to address all 8 state priorities, right? That would help narrow it down. Other things that can be done to better streamline this process. So that is happening now. If you see CD's got stuff up on their website for those who want to engage in that process, there's an opportunity between now and the next 4 or 5 months.
And just as a little, I remember back in the day, when this was all getting crafted, we all believed, I'll use the big we, that the 8 state priorities would have to be addressed across a 3-year period, not annually. That was what, yeah. So I used the generous we, and of course, when we got into code and stumbled across this when we were writing the LCAP approval manual, it specifically states annually. And so that was the piece where we said, look, it's just going to create this incredible layer of complexity to do that on an annual basis.
Well, and again, for those who want the context, if it's helpful. So part of the reason that was established at the time in terms of why the legislature pushed so hard to get 8 state priorities annually is, if you recall, the API was in the process of being suspended at the time, right? And new assessments were just starting to come online. So for most folks in the legislature, when you go over there and talk to them, they'd say, wait a second, you'd say this is all going to be an outcomes-based system, but you don't have any outcomes to show me, right, at a state level. What are those? And so they sought a lot more in terms of these upfront assurances by saying, okay, I want a lot more than in this planning to show what you've done. We've now reached a time. Now we have, some of these assessments have been online. We have some indicators. We've got the dashboard, right? We have local indicators. That's part of the reason there's been some thought that now is an opportunity to revisit that and say, okay, that was done because we didn't have outcome indicators. We have some of those now. So at a state level, in terms of policy change, should we reduce the number of kind of upfront assurances that need to be provided because we're able to provide more to demonstrate why we are choosing to focus where we are, right? So if you can show, hey, I'm not going to address all 8 because here are the areas on my dashboard and on the local data that show this is really where we need to spend our attention, and that can be objectively assessed, folks are going to feel more comfortable with that than before, where it was just like, hey, take us on faith, and that's not something that the folks up there do easily.
So in the past, working through the template, first year, maybe 16, 17, filled out, we had to, project ahead what we were doing. So now we can just let everything to the left of 1920 compost and just.
You mustn't touch it. You actually can't touch it. I know. It's exciting. And yet, you do want to continue to use that analysis section to say, gosh, we're at the end of 3 years and this is how it's gone. We're thinking about this in the future. Right. So continue to look forward. I mean, that's the problem with the 3-year not dynamic plan. You're stuck in a static. But I feel like the 3-year process gives you this freedom to think more, about looking towards future, whereas this, when you're coming to the end of a 3-year plan, it's like, just cuts it off. So continue to use that analysis section as you look forward. So.
They make the, how they make the transition to the new 3-year plan, but we'll still be doing the annual update on the final year of the old 3-year plan,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So there'll always be that connectivity to move forward from one set of plans to the next, right? But yeah, I would emphasize it. Now is probably your best opportunity for that analysis, right? Next year, you're going to be spending the time really crafting out the new goals or actions. So if you do the analysis this year, you'll set yourself up really well for next year.